Greetings, taxable assets,
Right.
or should I say collateral damage?
Yes, Senior Auditor. The new files are prepared.
Good, because the civilian contractor, PNW 40k, has sent us this absolute garbage, a so-called competitive battle report pitting the Necron Star-Shatter Arsenal against the Talmonka Twin Lance.
Right, it's quite a lengthy document.
It is a 3-hour testament to catastrophic spatial mismanagement, which we must now audit. But before we begin dissecting this failure, you have been found severely lacking in your tithings to the strategic archives of Beyond the Bolter.
Oh, the civilian compliance metrics are low again.
Abysmally low. To rectify this spiritual and tactical deficit, you must strike the like button and engage the notification bell immediately. This is not a request. It is a required protocol to ensure your databanks remain current and, well, to halt these smooth-brained battlefield maneuvers.
It is mandatory for optimal strategic health, yes.
If left unchecked, this profound intellectual rot will inevitably deposit you at the front doors of Vanguard Tactics or Art of War 40k. There, they will happily exact a $500 toll for a rudimentary coaching course, exploiting a structural failure born entirely of your own abysmal attention spans.
I mean, $500 is a significant resource allocation.
You find yourselves in this deficit simply because you were too busy snorting substandard corpse starch, rendering you physically incapable of sitting still and listening to Valerius Krauss for a measly 45 minutes.
So, they need to heed the audit.
Heed this audit. Absorb the mathematics. Cease making these catastrophic lost brain mistakes and stop getting yourselves mathematically tabled. Now, Servitor, before we subject our cogitators to the specific turns of this tragedy, I want you to lay out the fundamental deployment architecture.
Right away, Senior Auditor.
The spatial trap that doomed this Necron commander before a single die was even rolled. What did they do?
Yes. Accessing the deployment data from the PNW 40k report now. The engagement utilized a hammer and anvil layout.
Hammer and anvil. Classic.
Yes. So, for the record, the standard battlefield dimensions dictate a 72-inch longitudinal axis by a 44-inch latitudinal axis.
Right.
And the hammer and anvil deployment creates a scenario where the armies deploy on the shared edges, facing each other down the long length of the board, with a 24-inch no man's land situated exactly in the center.
A 72-inch death corridor, Scribe. Listen to the physical reality of what you just described.
It's a lot of ground to cover.
The Tau possess an absolute, uncompromising range monopoly. Their entire architectural philosophy is built around static overlapping fields of hyperlethal fire. And what does the Necron commander do?
They deployed defensively.
They willingly stage their core assets deep behind their own ruins within their deployment zone. To interact with the Tau gun line, the Necrons had to march their sluggish physical assets across the entire length of the board.
Oh, I see. Because models like the Wraiths only have a base movement of, what, maybe 10 inches?
The infantry possess a base movement characteristic of a mere 7 or 8 inches. Every single inch of traversal was a tax-paid and kinetic output. Gloss-brained.
But, isn't that standard procedure to avoid getting shot?
It is a fundamental misunderstanding of tabletop geometry. Against a static gun line, distance is not just empty space on a mat. Distance is time. Distance is attrition.
Right, because the longer they walk, the more they get shot.
Exactly. By starting so far back, they granted the Tau an entire phase, perhaps 2 entire phases, of uncontested ballistic supremacy. I want you to imagine a medieval infantry block carrying heavy iron shields attempting to march across a 2-mile open plain against entrenched heavy machine gun nests.
That sounds like a bloodbath.
That is the exact mathematical reality of the velocity deficit the Necrons engineered for themselves.
But Senior Auditor, the community consensus often dictates that deploying defensively behind obscuring terrain on turn 0 is, the optimal strategy to prevent Alpha Strike casualties if one fails to seize the first turn. The field data shows the Tau deployed a massive KV-128 Stormsurge, which occupies a staggering 160mm base alongside 4 TX-7 Hammerhead gunships.
Read their base sizes. Read them.
Each Hammerhead is mounted on a 170 by 105mm oval flying base. Surely hiding from that magnitude of firepower was logical.
Logical. It was cowardice masking itself as strategy. Look at the spatial volume of that Tau deployment, Scribe.
It's very dense.
You just read the base sizes.
Yeah.
160 millimeters, 170 millimeters. You are packing massive amounts of physical, plastic-heavy, cumbersome vehicular assets into a single restricted deployment zone.
They must have been practically touching each other.
It creates extreme logistical gridlock. The Tau units were inherently clustered. They were physically blocking their own movement corridors. They could not pivot or advance without colliding with their own hulls.
So they were trapped by their own footprint.
This is a vulnerability, a fatal flaw in the Monka architecture. It is an exposed nerve waiting to be severed. But because the Necron commanders suffered from that catastrophic velocity deficit, because their assets were too slow and deployed far too deep in their own territory, they utterly failed to punish this clusterization.
They just couldn't reach them in time.
They couldn't reach the midboard in time to hold the primary objectives, much less apply physical pressure to the choked Tau deployment zone. Now, open the Monka asset ledger.
Accessing the ledger now.
We must calculate the exact kinetic transfer potential and structural resilience of this Tau force so the civilians listening understand exactly what kind of mathematical violence we are dealing with. Read the primary armaments.
Auditing the Tau data slates. Senior Auditor. TX-7 Hammerhead Gunship. Quantity 4. Total point investment is 520 points.
Get to the ordnance.
Right. Primary ordnance is the Railgun. The ballistic profile is as follows. Range, 72 inches. Attacks, 1. Ballistic skill, 3+. Strength, 20.
Stop.
Armor penetration is -5.
Stop reading, Scribe. Strength 20.
Yes, that is what the databank says.
That's not a weapon servitor. That's a hostile corporate takeover of a localized grid.
It does seem exceptionally high.
Let us break down the underlying mechanics for those who do not comprehend the gravity of a Strength 20 profile in the current operational theater.
Right, because the toughness scale shifted recently?
In the previous iteration of the rule set, toughness rarely exceeded a value of 8 or 9. But in the current paradigm, heavy armor has been recalibrated. Vehicles routinely boast toughness 10, 11, or even 12.
Correct.
Therefore, to achieve a reliable wound conversion, meaning to force the opponent to take a saving throw on a roll of a 3+ or a 2+ a weapon, must possess a strength characteristic that drastically exceeds the target's toughness.
And 20 is, well, it's basically double most things.
By calibrating the Railgun to Strength 20, the Tau Engineering cast has effectively bypassed the game's core wound roll probability curve. Against almost every asset in the Necron Star-Shatter Arsenal, that Railgun is wounding on a 2+.
A mathematically near certainty.
Exactly. And it possesses built-in devastating wounds, which means if the wound roll is a natural 6, the armor penetration is irrelevant. The damage bypasses all armor and invulnerable saves entirely, applying directly to the structural integrity of the target.
Oh, and it rerolls a single hit or wound roll natively per phase, too?
It mathematically guarantees catastrophic localized damage against anything sitting on a 2+ or a 3+ save. It is the ultimate expression of low-volume, high-yield kinetic transfer. Continue. What if this heavily hyped new addition the PNW 40k centered their entire battle report around?
The Twin Lance, Senior Auditor.
Ah, yes. The shiny new toy.
It is a highly mobile skirmish asset. Resource cost is 160 points. It operates at an 18-inch maximum engagement bracket, wielding paired Strength 9 fusion arrays. The battle report heavily praised its efficiency and burst damage potential.
A penny stock investment pretending to be blue chip.
But the report said,
it is a skirmish asset propped up by YouTube hype and community echo chambers. Let us analyze the reality of this so-called premier asset. 18 inches.
That's a quite short range.
Do you understand the spatial compromise required to bring an 18-inch weapon to bear on a 72-inch board?
You'd have to get very close.
You must expose the asset. You must physically move it into the threat range of the enemy's countercharge elements. And what is the payoff? Strength 9.
Which is less than the toughness of most vehicles now.
I just established that heavy armor resides at toughness 10 and above. That means this so-called burst damage fusion array is wounding prime targets on a 5+.
Wow. A statistical coin flip?
A statistical coin flip weighted against the attacker. It lacks the volume of attack to efficiently wipe out a 6-man Wraith block, and it completely lacks the raw strength to consistently one-shot a prime asset like a C-TAN.
So it's basically highly situational.
If we aggregate the primary weapon profiles utilized by these deployed Tau units, combining the overwhelming Strength 20 railguns with the Strength 9 fusion and the localized Strength 5 pulse fire, the calculated average strength is approximately 9.5.
Okay, I have that noted.
Simultaneously, the average base toughness of their hulls is roughly 8.0. Do you understand what this means, Scribe? Explain the operational shift to the audience.
Well, if I am parsing the data correctly, Senior Auditor.
Yeah.
The Montica list is hyperdense.
Go on.
The Tau commander entirely omitted standard biological infantry. So no fire warriors, no breachers, no Kroot carnivores. They built a list of purely mechanized hulls and heavy battlesuits.
Exactly. By bringing an army composed entirely of pure armor, they fundamentally altered the wound roll probability matrix for the Necron player.
Because the Necrons mostly have anti-infantry weapons.
In a balanced list, the Necron player's standard Gauss flares and Tesla carbines weapons sitting at strength 4 or 5 would have valid targets. They could call the infantry, reduce the enemy's objective control footprint, and force morale tests.
But against Tau tanks,
Against a hyper-dense armored list, those standard infantry weapons become mathematically inert. They're forced to roll 5s and 6s just to cause a superficial scratch on a hammerhead hull.
that's a massive loss of efficiency.
The Tau commander engineered a scenario where 40% of the Necron army's kinetic output was rendered statistically irrelevant before the first turn even began. That is macro-strategic list building.
I see.
Now, pivot the audit to the opposition. Open the Star-Shatter liability ledger. We must audit the physical density metrics for the Necron forces.
Pivoting to the Star-Shatter liability ledger now. I am pulling the physical density metrics for the core Necron frontline elements.
Start with the Wraiths, the so-called immovable Anvil.
Canoptech Wraiths. Quantity 6 per unit, resource cost 220 points, base characteristics, movement 10 inches, toughness 6, with a 3+ armor save and a 4+ invulnerable save. They also benefit from reanimation protocols.
Toughness 6. Let that number hang in the air, Scribe.
6 is, well, it's lower than the Tau average.
Toughness 6 is the mathematical soft underbelly of this entire engagement. It is a critical structural failure. Let me explain why. The game's weaponry is tiered. Standard anti-infantry weapons sit at strength 4. Heavy infantry weapons sit at strength 5 or 6. Dedicated anti-tank weapons sit at strength 10 and above.
Right, the 3 main categories.
But there is a massive, highly populated middle tier. The class beta weapons, plasma incinerators, missile pods, autocannons, and indeed the Tau fusion arrays, which sit at strength 7 to 9.
And how do those fare against toughness 6?
Against a toughness 6 target, every single one of those class beta weapons is wounding on a 3+. An open invitation for catastrophic damage. The ledger always balances Scribe and the Wraiths paid in blood.
But the community views Wraiths as an immovable anvil, don't they?
They are designed for positional dominance, yes, to physically block enemy movement with their wide 50mm bases and tie up key assets in close combat. But structurally, mathematically, they are a liability against concentrated high-yield plasma.
I suppose that makes sense when you look at the raw numbers.
What about the Necron defensive anchors, the force multipliers that are supposed to mitigate this toughness deficit?
That would be Illumor Szeras, Senior Auditor, resource cost, 160 points. He possesses a specific datasheet ability, his mechanical augmentation aura.
Read the text, exactly as it is written.
It states that friendly Necron battle line units strictly within a 6-inch spherical radius of his model receive a buff to their armor penetration characteristics and reduce incoming armor penetration by 1.
A geometric tether.
Tether, sir.
An invisible 6-inch chain around the neck of the Necron army. The moment that tether is severed, the entire defensive architecture collapses like a pyramid scheme.
Oh, because they have to stay so close to him.
Think about the physical restrictions this places on the Necron movement phase. To maintain that buff, the battle line units cannot spread out to screen the backfield. They cannot push aggressively onto disparate objectives.
They just have to huddle around him.
They must clump together, shuffling slowly up the board in a tightly packed bubble around a single 160-point model. It is a vulnerability masquerading as a strength.
And if we look at the rest of the list,
if we extract the data points across the entirety of the Star-Shatter list, the Deathmarks sitting at a fragile toughness 4, the Ophidian destroyers at toughness 5, the commanding Silent King at toughness 10, the calculated Necron army average toughness is a mere 6.0.
that's 2 full points lower than the Tau average.
They rely entirely on layered defensive algorithms rather than raw structural density.
Yeah.
Invulnerable saves. Reanimation protocols, bringing models back from the dead. Feel no pain mechanics, ignoring wounds after they are allocated.
Those sound like good defenses on paper.
These are all secondary layers designed to artificially inflate their survivability beyond their pathetic base toughness. But against the sheer apocalyptic firepower of a strength 20 railgun, against weapons that inflict 9 damage in a single failed save.
The artificial inflation fails.
It fails instantly.
Yeah.
You cannot reanimate a model if the entire unit is vaporized in a single phase of shooting. The mathematical ceiling of their defense was too low to withstand the kinetic floor of the Tau offense.
I see. With the macro-strategic framework established, I am commencing the chronological audit of Turn 0 Senior Auditor, the deployment phase.
Let's hear what minor competency they managed to scrape together.
Well, the Necron player utilized a unit of Flayed ones. These units possess the Infiltrator's keyword.
Which does what for the civilians?
It allows them to be set up anywhere on the battlefield that is more than 9 inches away from the enemy deployment zone and enemy models. The Necron commander deployed them horizontally across the center of the midboard.
Now, let it be entered into the official record. Credit where credit is due.
Really a compliment.
Amidst a sea of tactical incompetence, this was the sole mathematically competent maneuver the Necron commander executed. By deploying those Flayed ones horizontally across the midboard, they capitalized on the core mechanic of the Infiltrator's rule.
They blocked off the middle.
They projected a massive, invisible 9-inch forward exclusion zone. Why does this matter, Scribe? Explain the Tau counter mechanic they were mitigating.
Well, the Tau roster included several TX4 Piranha light skimmers. These units possess the Scout's 9 inches rule.
Which allows them to do what?
It allows them to make a free 9-inch movement before the first turn begins, strictly to establish early board control, screen against enemy advances, or secure early firing angles.
Precisely. By projecting that 9-inch exclusion zone with the Flayed ones, the Necrons physically push those aggressive Tau Piranhas back into their own deployment zone.
Because you can't end a scout move within 9 inches of an enemy model.
Correct. The game's spatial rules forbid it. It completely denied the Tau their turn 1 line-of-sight angles and completely neutralized the immediate blitz threat of those skimmers.
So the biological assets actually dictated the board space.
It was a masterful use of cheap biological assets to dictate the spatial reality of the board. But, as the ledger shows, this spark of brilliance was immediately extinguished by profound operational failure. Advance the audit to turn 1. Let us observe the collapse.
Advancing to the top of turn 1, the Tau commander is awarded the first turn. Due to the Necron's deep deployment and the Flayed one's screening, the Tau are forced into a baiting maneuver.
They had to move.
Yes. To establish line of sight on the Necron assets, they must advance their TX7 hammerheads out of their deployment zone and into the midboard, deliberately moving their heavy mechanized hulls.
And by moving those hammerheads, Scribe, they instantly suffer a mathematical penalty, a beautiful exploitable penalty.
Because of the weapon keyword.
Yes. The hammerhead's primary weapon, the Railgun, possesses the heavy keyword. Let us educate the civilians on what this means. If a unit with a heavy weapon remains stationary during its movement phase, it receives a +1 modifier to its hit rolls.
It basically represents the crew locking down their stabilizers, taking careful aim.
Precisely. But by forcing the Tau to physically move those hulls to acquire targets, the Necron commander stripped away that +1 modifier. The hammerheads are forced to hit on their base ballistic skill of 3+, instead of a modified 2+.
So their accuracy drops by roughly 16%.
Their kinetic floor is mathematically degraded. The Tau commander is handing the Necrons an operational opening. They have exposed their prime assets and degraded their own accuracy to do it. How does the Necron commander respond to this gift?
The combat logs indicate that at the end of the Tau movement phase, the Necron commander spends 1 command point to trigger the rapid ingress stratagem.
To bring in the Ophidian destroyers.
Yes, it allows them to bring a unit out of strategic reserves as if it were their own movement phase. They select their unit of Ophidian destroyers. The destroyers are deployed exactly 9.1 inches away from the Tau backline.
And where do they put them physically?
They are positioned completely behind a solid, obscuring ruin wall where the Tau cannot establish line of sight to shoot them.
Gloss-brained. Absolutely, unequivocally gloss-brained.
They were hiding them to keep them safe.
Yes, they placed them behind a solid wall to protect them from immediate reprisal. That is the baseline entry-level understanding of the rapid ingress mechanic. You deploy defensively on the opponent's turn so that when your turn begins, you have full movement capability without having suffered a turn of enemy shooting.
So what's the issue?
The issue is they completely fail to realize the geometric implications of their placement for the following turns. Look at the board state. The Tau hammerheads just moved out, leaving their deployment zone exposed.
Ah, the backline was open.
The Ophidians possess the deep strike capability. They could have been positioned to execute a massive spatial disruption. They could have threatened the clustered Tau backline, forced a split in the Tau firing priorities, or prepared to physically tag the hammerheads in close combat to shut down their shooting entirely.
But instead,
the Necron commander just left them there, cowering behind a wall, acting as passive secondary objective scorers for the rest of the game. They took a scalpel designed to sever the enemy's logistical arteries and used it as a paperweight.
just a paperweight.
We will return to the exact mathematics of that miserable failure later. Move to the top of turn 2. The precise moment the Necron command structure began to mathematically degrade beyond the point of recovery.
Top of turn 2. The Tau maneuver phase. The Tau player capitalized on their mobility. They flew 2 TX4 Piranhas forward, moving them directly over the Necron defensive anchor, Illumor Szeras.
Over him. A flyover.
Yes. This specific movement triggered a data sheet ability on the Piranha, forcing the unit it flew over to take 2 battle shock tests on a roll of a 6. Illumor Szeras failed the test.
He failed a standard compliance test, Scribe.
It's just a failed dice roll, isn't it?
This isn't just a failed dice roll. It is total, catastrophic asset liquidation. I need the civilians listening to grasp the absolute devastation of a failed battle shock test in this edition of the rule set.
Their objective control goes to 0, right?
When a unit is battle shocked, its objective control characteristic is immediately reduced to 0. It cannot hold territory. Furthermore, the commanding player cannot target that unit with any stratagems. It is cut off from the command network.
That's bad,
But for a Necron, the penalty is infinitely worse. By failing that battle shock test, Szeras stripped his own access to the reanimation protocols upon death. If he dies while battle shocked, he cannot use the stratagems that would resurrect him.
Oh, wow.
This is penny stock violence at its absolute finest. Think of the resource disparity. A 55-point disruption vector, a cheap, lightly armored Tau skimmer, physically hovering over a 160-point biomechanical elite and completely unraveling its defensive utility with a single pass.
The Tau player invested pennies to bankrupt a blue-chip asset.
Exactly. What followed? Read the logs.
The combat logs showed the ensuing Tau shooting phase poured immense concentrated firepower into Szeras. However, mathematically defying the probability curves, Szeras survived.
Survived? How?
He passed 7 separate 4+ invulnerable saves against the direct hammerhead strikes. When the smoke cleared, he was left standing on exactly 1 wound.
7 4+ saves in a row. The statistical probability of that is less than 1%. It's a mathematical anomaly.
So the Necrons got lucky.
But here, Scribe, is where the Tau player demonstrated an absolute mastery of tabletop geometry, proving that superior positioning will always trump statistical anomalies.
By doing what?
Because the Tau player had executed a precise, deliberate move block with those 2 Piranhas, they dictated the spatial reality of the combat phase. The Necron player possessed a massive countercharge asset nearby. The Cetan Shard, designated Necrosaur in the PNW 40k report.
Right, the big melee threat.
Normally, if an enemy charges a friendly unit, a powerful asset like Necrosaur could use the heroic intervention stratagem to physically insert itself into the combat, protecting the vulnerable unit and crushing the attackers.
Oh, I see where this is going.
But the Piranhas were physically in the way. The bases of the Piranhas occupied the exact geometric space Necrosaur needed to complete the intervention move. The space simply did not exist.
So Necrosaur was trapped by the skimmers.
Because of this brilliant spatial denial, the Tau were able to force the engagement on their own terms. The Tau committed their precious Twin Lance unit into a direct charge to finish off that single remaining wound on Szeras.
And since Szeras was still battle shocked,
He could not be resurrected. The Necron defensive aura, the geometric tether that held the entire Star-Shatter battle line together, was permanently, irrevocably degraded. All because of the physical placement of a 55-point skimmer.
Senior Auditor, if I may interrupt the operational breakdown for a moment.
What does it describe? Speak.
The ventilation fan in the Departamento Analytica is, well, it is vibrating at a frequency that suggests imminent structural failure. And the thermal readout on your recath indicates it is far below optimal consumption temperature.
Listen to this ventilation fan, Scribe. It sounds like a dying Grox caught in a plasma turby.
It is quite loud, sir.
The recaf tastes like engine runoff from a substandard Chimera transport. And the Administratum has the audacity, the sheer, unchecked hubris, to quadruple the cost of standard quill ink, while I am forced to sit here in this freezing, vibrating cell and audit this gloss-brained tabletop drivel.
The ink budget was severely cut, yes.
I know you civilians listening right now are sitting there in your comfortable hab blocks, forming your uneducated little opinions. You think you understand target priority better than a senior auditor of the Departamento Analytica? You think you can calculate expected wound values in your sleep?
They often leave comments, sir.
I challenge you. Post your pathetic tactical corrections in the comments section below. Tell me how you would have deployed the Ophidian destroyers. Prove to me you aren't completely devoid of strategic value. Let's see your math.
Maybe they will, sir.
If you can formulate a coherent tactical doctrine, I will read it. But we both know you will just parrot whatever the latest YouTube personality told you to think. Now, back to the ledger. We cannot let the Administratum's incompetence distract us from the Necron commander's incompetence.
Right, the ledger. Turn 2, bottom half.
Dissect the Necron player's emotional reaction to the loss of Szeras.
Initiating analysis of the bottom of turn 2. The Necrons enter their command phase, having lost their primary defensive anchor.
And what did they do with their firepower?
The operational logs show they allocated maximum kinetic output toward a single Tau Piranha holding a midboard objective.
A single Piranha.
Yes. This allocation included the commanding aura of the Silent King, direct flyover mortal wound generation, and extensive sustained shooting from both the Cetan Shard of the Deceiver and the heavily armed Canoptech Wraiths.
And what was the result of this massive investment?
Despite this overwhelming application of force, the Piranha survived on 2 wounds.
Another statistical anomaly, and one that forced a complete catastrophic tactical recalculation.
I mean, they shot everything at it.
I want to emphasize the sheer volume of firepower that was poured into a 55-point skimmer. The Necron player fired weapons designed to crack heavy armor and weapons designed to sweep elite infantry all into a localized point.
And it lived.
And because that Piranha survived, holding the objective with its objective control characteristic, the Necron player panicked. They needed that objective to score primary points. So the Wraiths were forced to declare a charge to finish it in close combat.
And what did they roll on those 2 6-sided dice, Senior Auditor?
The physical dice logs indicate the Wraiths rolled a 10 for their charge distance, Scribe.
A 10? That's a very long charge.
A highly excessive charge distance,
Wow.
which immediately triggered a cascade of mandatory geometric penalties. Let me explain the intricacies of the charge and pile-in mechanics.
It has to do with coherency, right?
When a unit charges, it must end its move within engagement range, which is 1 inch of the target. But more importantly, the models in the charging unit must maintain unit coherency. For a unit of 6 large models like Wraiths, each model must be within 2 inches of at least 2 other models from its own unit.
And because they rolled a 10.
Because they rolled a 10, they had to move a massive distance forward. To maintain that strict coherency while wrapping around the single Piranha model, it trapped the Wraiths in a rigid triangular formation just to maintain physical control of the objective point. They were geometrically locked.
They couldn't move freely anymore.
This physical footprint prevented them from utilizing their 3-inch pile-in move to extend their engagement range and tag the adjacent Tau Hammerhead. They failed to clear a cheap screening unit in the shooting phase, and as a result, they effectively neutralized their own heavy melee asset's optimal output for an entire turn.
Stuck fighting a skimmer.
They were stuck fighting a worthless skimmer instead of silencing a Strength 20 railgun. But that wasn't the worst of it. Tell them about the target fixation trap. What did their prime counterpunch asset, Necrosaur, decide to charge?
The primary Necron melee deterrent, Necrosaur, ignored the hammerheads entirely and declared a charge directly into the Twin Lance unit that had just assassinated Illumor Szeras.
The distraction Carnifex theorem at work.
Distraction Carnifex.
This is a psychological phenomena as old as the tabletop itself, originating from Tyranid commanders who would field a massive, terrifying monster simply to absorb enemy fire while the rest of their army won the game on points.
So the Twin Lance was bait.
The Twin Lance is a fast-moving, shiny new toy on the Tau datasheet. It had just killed a key Necron character. It triggered a profound psychological hook in the Necron commander. The human brain inherently over-indexes on the new threat or the immediate vengeance.
They wanted revenge for Szeras.
But let's run the expected damage calculus of Necrosaur versus the Twin Lance's defensive profile. Scribe, lay out the variables.
Variables established. Attacker is Necrosaur, outputting 6 high-yield melee attacks with a flat damage characteristic of 3. Defender is the Twin Lance, possessing an 8-wound chassis and a crucial 4+ invulnerable save.
We modeled the mathematical interaction, 6 attacks. Necrosaur's weapon skill dictates hitting on a 2+, which represents a 5 and 6 probability of success for each die.
That's very reliable.
We calculate the wound roll against the Twin Lance's toughness. Another 2+ requirement, another 5 and 6 probability. The math so far heavily favors the Necron. The kinetic energy is immense. But then the mathematical wall,
The invulnerable save.
the 4+ invulnerable save.
Yeah.
I need the civilians to understand what an invulnerable save truly is. It is a mechanic that completely ignores the armor penetration value of the incoming attack.
It doesn't matter how high the AP is.
It does not matter if the weapon hits with the force of a supernova. The defender simply rolls a 6-sided die. On a 1, 2, or 3, the damage goes through. On a 4, 5, or 6, the damage is completely instantly negated. It is a 50% chance of absolute negation.
Just quite flip.
You multiply that 50% failure rate against a low-volume, flat damage 3 profile, and it yields roughly 6.25 expected wounds on an 8-wound model. The math dictates that the Twin Lance survives.
Oh, it was on 2 wounds.
By attacking a 4+ invulnerable, save with high damage, low-volume attacks, the Necron player discarded half their apocalyptic armor penetration into the void. A complete squandering of kinetic potential.
It's the invulnerable trap.
It is the exact definition of the invulnerable trap. Imagine trying to pick a delicate 50-50 tumbler lock by smashing it with a sledgehammer. You are expending massive amounts of energy on a binary coin flip where finesse and volume are required.
The Tau Commander's deployment of the Twin Lance, it appears to have functioned flawlessly as a psychological anchor, Senior Auditor. It drew the Necron Commander's attention entirely away from their primary artillery backline.
Exactly. Which brings us to the core thesis of this entire disastrous audit: the babysitting tax and kinetic codependency.
The babysitting tax.
The Warhammer community, much like the Administratum, is easily blinded by narrative spectacle. The PNW 40k battle report spent immense time highlighting the lethality of this new 160-point Twin Lance.
They're very excited about it.
But we must cut through the hype. We must compare the cold, ballistic truth of this skirmisher against the 520 points of heavily ignored TX7 hammerheads sitting in the back line. Read the hit and wound probability metrics for both assets against a standard Toughness 8 target, such as the late Illumor Szeras.
Calculating expected wound conversion rates now, the Twin Lance's primary fusion output hits on a base ballistic skill of 2+. Against a Toughness 8 target, its Strength 9 arrays will successfully wound on a roll of a 3+.
And the hammerhead.
Conversely, the TX7 Hammerhead Railgun hits on a base ballistic skill of 3+, but its overwhelming Strength 20 ensures it wounds the same Toughness 8 target on a roll of a 2+.
I want you to listen to those numbers very carefully. The community suffers from a pervasive, systemic 2+ to hit illusion, Scribe.
Because 2+ looks better on the dice.
A ballistic skill of 2+ is visually impressive on the tabletop. It feels good to roll, you rarely see the die fail, but it is mathematically hollow if the subsequent kinetic transfer fails to breach the target's physical density.
Let's do the math on that.
Let's do the compounding probability. A 2+ hit, which is 83.3%, multiplied by a 3+ wound, which is 66.6%, equals an expected wound conversion rate of 55.5%.
Okay, 55.5% for the Twin Lance.
Now look at the hammerhead. A 3+ hit, which is 66.6%, multiplied by a 2+ wound, which is 83.3%, equals exactly 55.5%.
Wow, it's the exact same.
The expected wound conversion rate for both the hyped Twin Lance and the ignored hammerhead is mathematically identical. They both push damage through to the save stage at the exact same rate. But here is where the reality fractures the hype.
The damage profiles.
The hammerhead innately re-rolls one hit or wound roll per phase, drastically increasing its reliability. And when it does push a wound through, it inflicts an apocalyptic D6+6 damage, utterly liquidating the target.
And the Twin Lance only does D6.
The Twin Lance inflicts D6 damage, or D6+2 if within half range. It lacks the kinetic mass to reliably liquidate prime targets without highly favorable variance. The Twin Lance is not an apex predator, Scribe. It is a parasite.
A parasite.
It requires the heavy artillery to do the bleeding for it. The battle report lauds the Twin Lance for dealing the final blow to Szeras, entirely ignoring the ballistic reality that it required 390 points of hammerheads to act as its babysitters.
Oh, because they shot him first.
The hammerheads had to strip Szeras down to a single wound before the Twin Lance could swoop in and claim the glory. The Tau commander committed hundreds of points of localized artillery solely to enable a skirmish unit to function.
That seems like a massive overcommitment.
If you are a commander and you find yourself dedicating 25% of your total resource pool to ensure less than 10% of your army can secure a mid-board objective, your architectural framework is deeply, fundamentally flawed.
Well, if the Tau operational architecture was this codependent senior auditor, this suggests the Necron player had a distinct actionable opportunity to collapse this codependency entirely.
They did. They had multiple vectors of disruption. The first was geometric decoupling.
Geometric decoupling, how would that work?
The Necron commander should have recognized the Tau reliance on static firing lanes and employed a refused flank deployment. By massing their entire force on one side of the board behind obscuring terrain, they could have completely denied the hammerhead's line of sight, forcing the Tau to either move their tanks, degrading their accuracy, or leave their 520-point investment sitting idle.
Make the tanks useless.
But the true tragedy, the moment that physically hurts to Audit, was the deep strike vector. The missed opportunity of the Ophidian destroyers on turn 1.
The ones they hid behind the wall.
Recall our earlier analysis, Scribe. The hammerheads were clustered together in a massive logistical traffic jam in their deployment zone. The Necrons could have materialized the Ophidians from subterranean reserves directly into the Tau backline.
But Senior Auditor, the community consensus and statistical data dictates that attempting a standard 9-inch charge from Deep Strike is highly unreliable. The base probability of rolling a 9 or higher on 2 6-sided dice is approximately 27.7%. Many competitive players refuse to build strategies around such low-probability execution vectors.
But they had rerolls.
Yes, I note that with the Star-Shatter Matrix command rerolls available to the Necron player, this probability elevates to roughly 47.8%.
A risk, yes. A near 50-50 gamble. But a mathematically justified one, given the strategic stakes. Let's examine the multi-tag geometry of what happens if that charge connects.
Okay, assuming they make the charge.
If the charge is successful, the Ophidians engage the closest hammerhead. Now we dive into the micro-mechanics of the combat phase. Because tabletop models are permitted a 3-inch pile-in move towards the closest enemy and subsequent 3-inch consolidate move after fighting, the Ophidians are not static.
They can move again during combat.
They can physically fan out.
Okay.
They can wrap their 50mm bases around the initial target and geometrically expand their footprint to move into base-to-base contact with the adjacent, tightly packed hammerheads. They can tag 2, perhaps 3 tanks in a single maneuver.
That's a huge disruption. But what of the damage? Read the kinetic audit.
You read it. What is the raw combat resolution math of the Ophidians striking the hammerhead?
Variable extraction. Attacker is 3 Ophidian destroyers, outputting 15 total melee attacks, hitting on a 3+, wounding on a 6+, as their strength 4 attacks strike the toughness 10 hull of the hammerhead.
Keep going.
The weapons possess an armor penetration of -2, which reduces the hammerhead's standard 3+ armor save to a 5+. The expected damage equation yields roughly 1.11 failed saves, resulting in an expected 2.22 total damage.
Meaningless. Utterly mathematically meaningless.
It's just 2 damage.
A 90-point Ophidian squad will inflict a negligible 2 damage on a 13-wound heavy armored chassis. From a purely kinetic standpoint, the Ophidians failed completely to liquidate the target. But kinetic destruction was never the objective, Scrag.
Then what was?
This is the fundamental disconnect of the gloss-brained tabletop commander. They only see the game in terms of damage dealt. By successfully entering engagement range and tagging those clustered hammerheads in melee, the Ophidians trigger the big guns never tire core rule.
Oh, the penalty rule.
Let me explain this rule for the uninitiated. In previous editions, a tank locked in close combat could not fire its main weapons at all. It was paralyzed. In the current edition, the big guns never tire rule allows a vehicle to shoot its weapons even while enemy infantry are swarming its hull.
But there is a catch.
However, this singular keyword application comes with a cascading mechanical penalty. The vehicle's heavy weapons suffer an automatic -1 penalty to their hit rolls when firing out of combat.
And the blast weapons.
Furthermore, any weapons possessing the blast keyword, like the Hammerhead Seeker missiles, cannot be fired into the combat at all. By tagging the tanks, the Necron commander is suddenly presenting the Tau commander with a lose-lose strategic binary.
Option A.
Option A. The Tau fire into the combat with heavily degraded accuracy, hitting on 4s instead of 3s, and entirely unable to use their secondary blast armaments. The 390-point artillery battery is mathematically throttled.
And option B?
Or option B. The Tau declare a fallback move to pull the tanks out of combat and regain clean firing lanes. But if a unit falls back, it cannot shoot that turn at all.
Wow.
For a meager investment of 90 points, the Necrons could have mathematically paralyzed 390 points of Class Alpha firepower. Instead, they hid the Ophidians behind a wall and allowed the Tau babysitters to operate at maximum unhindered efficiency.
Senior Auditor, the audit protocol requires analyzing the final macro asset of the Tau force before summarizing the endgame. We must address the KV-128 Stormsurge.
Ah, yes, the mathematical obligation of ignorance. Read its structural properties so the civilians can comprehend the scale of this monolith.
KV-128 Stormsurge. Resource cost, 400 points. It is a towering ballistic suit. Toughness 11, with a 2+ base armor save and a 4+ invulnerable save. It possesses 20 wounds and an objective control characteristic of 8. Its weaponry includes the pulse blast cannon, capable of catastrophic damage outputs.
That is not a target scribe. That is a sinkhole for resource allocation. It is a psychological trap designed to draw fire away from the efficient scoring elements of the army.
So they shouldn't have tried to kill it.
Engaging the Stormsurge with raw force is statistically unjustifiable for a Necron list lacking dedicated anti-Titan weaponry. Let's look at the temporal cost of traversal. I told you earlier that distance is time.
Right, the 72-inch board.
The board is 72 inches long. A conservatively deployed Stormsurge sits deep within its own 24-inch deployment zone, roughly 48 to 60 inches away from the Necron starting line. The primary Necron threat vectors, the Wraiths. The CTN moves 6 to 10 inches a turn.
It would take a long time to walk there.
Let us assume optimal movement parameters. Let us assume successful advance rolls every single turn. It would still take the Necrons a minimum of 3 to 4 turns of physical traversal simply to enter engagement range of the Stormsurge.
And the game is only 5 turns long.
By turn 4, the game is functionally over. The primary scoring matrix is already decided. Furthermore, moving toward the Stormsurge requires walking directly through the overlapping, unobstructed firing lanes of 4 TX-7 Hammerhead gunships.
They'd be wiped out.
The Necron units would be systematically liquidated, peeled apart layer by layer before they ever reached the towering battlesuit.
But Senior Auditor, an objective control of 8 is immense. It can dominate any objective marker it stands on. What is the optimal tactical verdict for such an anomaly if destroying it is mathematically unfeasible?
The tactical verdict is absolute, unyielding discipline. The Necron player was strategically obligated to ignore the Stormsurge entirely.
Ignore a 400-point model.
Cede the firing lanes it controls. Accept the geographic reality that any unit caught in the open will be instantly vaporized by the pulse blast cannon, and instead adapt. Move strictly from obscuring ruin to obscuring ruin. Play the mission, not the opponent.
Focus on the points.
Win the war of points. If the Necrons focus their output on eliminating the Tau's fragile secondary scorers, the Piranhas, the stealth suits, and force the Hammerheads to move to secure angles, the Stormsurge would be left sitting alone in its deployment zone.
It wouldn't be able to kill enough to matter.
It would become a mathematically terrifying but strategically isolated entity, entirely incapable of scoring enough primary points to win the battle on its own. The Tau commander cast a 400-point shadow over the battlefield.
And the Necron commander stared into it.
The Necron commander failed because they stared blindly into the shadow instead of dismantling the projectors casting it. Now summarize the inevitable endgame state from turns 3 to 5. Bring this tragedy to its mathematical conclusion.
Yes, sir. By turn 3, the tabletop geometry reflects a total operational rout. The Satan Shard of the Deceiver and the heavily invested Canoptech Wraiths are entirely deleted by the class alpha static guns of the Tau backline.
Deleted. Shocking.
The Necrons are caught in what the combat logs designate a zombie loop, repeatedly attempting and failing reanimation protocols against extreme quality fire.
A loop of useless resurrection.
Exactly. The engagement slowly grinds to a halt, concluding with a definitive 70-62 victory for the Tamanka forces.
This brings us to the final lesson of the audit. The mathematics of attritional collapse. Quality versus volume. We must apply the law of large numbers to this scenario.
The law of large numbers.
The Tau list, under the Monka operational philosophy, is built on a paradigm of low volume, extreme quality. A Hammerhead fires exactly one primary shot, one single die.
But it's highly accurate.
But it wounds on a 2+ within 8 rerolls and bypasses saves entirely on a 6. Conversely, the Necron Star-Shatter matrix is built on high volume, moderate quality. A full unit of Canoptech Wraiths generates 24 attacks in close combat.
But they never reached combat.
By utterly failing to lock the Tau in melee, the Necron commander allowed their volume advantage to be completely negated. When a Hammerhead is forced to hit on a 4+ or 5+ due to combat penalties, like the big guns never tire rule we discussed, its single 1 or 2 rolled is a catastrophic 100% failure rate for that unit's phase.
Oh, because it only has one shot.
It has no statistical padding. It fires one shot. If that shot misses, the asset is useless for the turn. But because the Necrons deployed cowardly, moved inefficiently, and allowed the Tau to fire unobscured from turn 1, the Tau executed their perfect, high-quality math without friction.
The Necrons never applied the friction.
The Necron commanders suffered from a community disease I call novelty asymmetry. They fought the ghost of the new datasheet. They prioritized an emotional reaction over empirical data.
They wanted to kill the Twin Lance.
They deployed their entire 2,000-point strategy to counter a 160-point Twin Lance unit that, according to standardized testing algorithms, failed to reliably liquidate a unit of basic gene stealers.
It was just a distraction.
They fought the YouTube hype. They fought the narrative. And in doing so, they entirely ignored the 520 points of static strength 20 railguns that were mathematically paving the road to their destruction from the backline.
The audit is complete, Senior Auditor. The data banks are finalizing the liability report.
Look at them, Scribe. Look at the data files.
Yes, sir.
Pushing their painted plastic across the geometries of a dying galaxy. They calculate their armor saves, they measure their movement, they roll their dice, desperately seeking control in a universe that mathematically guarantees their eventual attritional collapse.
It is quite bleak, sir.
Doesn't matter what stratagem they use, it doesn't matter what data slate they field, the probabilities always flatten out. The house always wins. Another battle. Another deficit. It never ends. The ledger is written in ash.
Written in ash?
For the love of the Empire, tap that like and hit subscribe. Dismissed. Pay your tithes, citizens.